Okay, we're going to get started here. I was going to announce this. I'm Professor Murphy, and welcome to the second Berges lecture. Mr. Knauss is with us, but as you can see, he's here on the screen rather than person. He called me a week ago saying he really had to be in California these 2 days, and so I looked at his PowerPoint slides, and they're very much on target for the Berges lecture series, so he was gracious enough to do this remotely, and this is the first time at the Jordan Auditorium we're trying this experiment, so welcome to a first here in Mendoza. But let me properly introduce our speaker tonight, Donald R. Knauss, who's chairman of the board and CEO of the Clorox company, position he's held since October of 2006. He has overall responsibility for the company's worldwide business, which generated revenues of over $5.6 billion last year. Prior to joining Clorox, he held a number of positions at Coca-Cola in the Minute Maid area. He was also in the international division, 10 countries in South Africa. Prior to that, he was with the Frito-Lay and Tropicana divisions of PepsiCo, and Procter & Gamble is where he started his career. He's on the board of directors at Kellogg Company, which is just up the road in Battle Creek, Michigan. He has a long-standing commitment to promoting workplace equality and embracing diversity. 2006, he received the Jackie Robinson Foundation's award for his expanding the opportunities for minorities in the corporate world. I know he's disappointed being here because he's a native of Highland, Indiana, which is just down the toll road about 50 miles from where we sit. He has a bachelor's degree from Indiana University. One of his personal passions is promoting education. He's on the board of trustees at both Morehouse College and the Marine Corps University Foundation. He's a Marine Corps veteran. In 2007, he and his wife launched the Knauss Scholars Program, where 15 children of Clorox employees are given a stipend for studying in higher education. So even though he's not physically here, please join me in a round of applause for Mr. Don Knauss.
Thanks, Professor Murphy. Well, as the professor said, I really wish I could be there this evening, but some of you may have seen a press release we sent out about 2 hours ago, where I'm stepping down as CEO in November, remaining as chairman of the board, and we just promoted one of our chief operating officers to replace me as CEO in November, so obviously had to be in California today to handle that. I don't know, Professor Murphy, if Jeremy is there. I'm getting an echo. I don't know if you guys can do anything on your end.
I'm working on that.
So I'll just soldier on here. Can you hear me all right?
Yes. There we go.
Okay. So I know that you can see that what we'll do here, I think we're having a little bit of video trouble or audio video trouble. What I'll do is we'll go to the slides. I think everyone in the audience can hear me. You probably won't see me. But when we do the Q&A, I'll come back on screen. But we'll try and pretend this is a fireside chat on the radio, the way it used to be, I guess, years ago. But if you could go to the first slide, Jeremy, post this opening slide. What I wanted to talk about today on leadership, it's probably one of the more hackneyed words used in business today, but probably the best definition I've heard over time in my 38 years of doing this kind of work is rallying people to a better future. I think one of the mistakes that companies or organizations get into is they don't explain why they're doing something. They jump to what or how. And I think one of the successes of Clorox is we really spent a lot of time as a leadership team trying to understand why we're doing what we're doing. And the mission of this company is very simple. And we try to make everyday life better every day. Sounds simple, it is simple, but it really energizes our people. What we're trying to do is obviously build big share brands in these smaller categories, and I'll talk about that in a minute, And how we're doing that is building a world-class marketing organization. So why don't you go to the next slide, Jeremy? So when you think about leadership, it really is, and I talked about this, I think when Professor Murphy saw the New York Times interview I did back in March, it really is a head and a heart situation. There's a thought leadership component, obviously, a rational component where you as a leader have to envision the future. You've got to paint that picture for the future. But then there's the heart side of this, which is, how do you energize other people in that vision? I think there's an old saying that, a strategy without execution is a hallucination. And what you're trying to do here is get both sides of this coin working in concert. Let me go next. So if you look at how we translate that at Clorox from a thought leadership side, and I'm going to spend the bulk of the talk on the heart side, but I want to talk a little bit about what we're trying to accomplish on the head side. As I said, the mission of this company, very simple, we make everyday life better every day. We're one of those companies where from the time you get up in the morning to the time you go to bed, you may interact with one of our brands, whether it's putting a sandwich, you make a sandwich for yourself for lunch in the morning and put it in a Glad sandwich bag, to you get your Brita pitcher out of the refrigerator and have a glass of water, to putting Burt's Bees lip balm on your lip when you're walking to class, you name it. We've got brands that interact with people all day long throughout their lives, and that's what we do. What we do and what we're trying to do is gain this lifetime loyalty with consumers. I think that's probably the most difficult thing to do is how do you keep a sustained relationship with a consumer over multiple decades, if you will. And the how we do that is we do what we call a 3D demand plan. So we think there are 3 moments of truth with a consumer. And I think this applies. I've been at the Procter & Gamble company. I've been at PepsiCo. I've been at Coca-Cola. I've had the opportunity to work on some great brands over my career, but this approach applies to all of them. It really starts with desire, which is think about this as pre-purchase marketing. So before someone walks into an outlet or before they click that mouse, how do you create a relationship, an orientation to your brand? So obviously that's through advertising, whether that's digital, television, radio, print, you name it. There are a myriad number of ways to connect with consumers today, much more than when I started at Procter & Gamble in 1981, but you're trying to create this desire. So let's say you do a good job of that, and then they walk into an outlet, whether it's a Safeway, a Kroger, a Walmart, Target, you name it. You're trying to get them to decide at the point of purchase, are they going to go for your brand? So you've got these 2 moments of truth, one pre-purchase, one at the point of purchase. Let's say you win those 2. And for Clorox, for example, in the United States, we spend a little over $1 billion a year trying to create that desire and that decide in our favor. Well, let's say you do that pretty well. They picked up the brand, they take it home. Have you delighted them or irritated the hell out of them? And, we have really focused on product superiority in our company. When I got here about 8 years ago, about 15% of our brands had what we call a 60-40 blind in-home use win. So, for example, if I gave somebody in the audience, if I gave you two products, say they were trash bags, plain white wrappers, no branding, take them home, use them for a week or 2, tell me which one you prefer. We wanted 60 out of 100 people to say we preferred Clorox's brand. Well, we had about 15% of our products had that advantage, blind, 8 years ago. Today, it's almost 60% of our products have that advantage. So in a world that is so digital now, where, when we started this 8 years ago, Twitter didn't exist. Facebook really didn't exist. It was MySpace, I think, when I got here in 2006. With that world the way it is, if you don't delight people with your brand experience, you're going to lose them pretty quickly. So think about that as pre-purchase, point of purchase, post-purchase marketing. That's how we enable ourselves to build share. 80% of our brands today are number 1 or number 2 in their category, whether it's Kingsford charcoal in charcoal, whether it's Clorox bleach, whether it's Glad trash bags, you name it. Most of our brands are number 1 or number 2, and I think it's that model that does it. So that's kind of the rational side of what we're trying to do. Let's go to the next slide. When you think about, though, energizing other people in that vision, how do you get the best and the brightest really connected to the business? And how do you keep them engaged to execute that vision? I think the only way you do it is you have an organization that has clear values that resonate with people, and you have a leadership profile or traits that really people want to sign on for, that where they think the leadership of the company is more interested in them than interested in themselves. So at Clorox, the values on the left side of that page, they're actually paired and they're kind of in conflict with each other, but stretch for results, but do the right thing. So we want people to stretch, but we want them to do it with integrity. We want to win the right way. And then the last two, taking personal ownership, but working together to win. So those values have been in place here for several decades. What wasn't in place when I got here was the leadership traits. And while the values were embedded somewhat in the company, I didn't see an articulation of the behaviors we wanted our people to exhibit to keep those values alive over time. And, my experience, whether it was in the Marine Corps or when I started my business career in 1981 at Procter, these 5 traits are the same traits I've seen in every successful person. I guess I call them the traits of effective people. It doesn't matter what industry you're in, whether you're an academic, a business person, in government, politics, you name it. But integrity, curiosity, optimism, compassion, and humility. And I want to talk a little bit about them and how I see them in a business context. So let's go to the next slide. If you think about those 5 traits, they really surround this issue of competence and judgment. Obviously, you could have those 5 traits, but if you don't have competence in what you're doing, no one's going to follow you. And if you don't have good judgment, again, no one's going to follow you. And sometimes you can have extremely bright people with very bad judgment. I mean, I'm sure Chris Christie wishes he had different people in his office instead of people that block roads going to Bridges. I'm sure they did well on their SATs, but their judgment's not very good. So, it's really important that you have that grounding in competence and judgment, and then those 5 traits surround those. So let me talk a little bit about those traits, starting with integrity. So if you can go to the next slide. So I think it really starts here. Integrity is the foundation. I put Barbara Jordan and George Marshall up here. It's kind of an interesting mix of 2 people, but I want to talk about why I think they bring this trait alive for me and hopefully for you. But I do think integrity here, and it's really 2 dimensions of integrity. It's telling the truth. When they swear you in a court of law, they say tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Because there's a lot of times people leave stuff out. They don't overtly lie. But in a business situation, certainly for the job I'm in, I've got to have the facts, and I've got to have them quickly. And so I need people to tell me the truth. And it really does build trust. And I think that trust is obviously the grease of commerce in a way. It gets things done quickly. When people trust you, we get things done quickly. Standing up for what you think is right. I think when you leave Notre Dame, regardless of where you go or what you do, you owe the organization you're going to work at a point of view about what you think is right for the business. And that's the second dimension of this. The reason I put Barbara Jordan up here, here's a woman who graduated from high school with honors at 16 in Houston, Texas in 1952. Brilliant student, wanted to go to the University of Texas in Austin, where actually my youngest son is today as a senior. She couldn't get in because she was black. So she went to Texas Southern University, graduated magna cum laude, the first black woman to be elected to the Texas Senate after Reconstruction, the first African American from Texas, female elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, civil rights pioneer, did tremendous work on behalf of everyone for civil rights, stood up all along, suffered with multiple sclerosis and leukemia, soldiered on. And in 1979, she ended up as a professor at the University of Texas. So the very school that wouldn't let her in because she was black, she's now teaching ethics at the University of Texas starting in 1979. In 2009, they unveiled a statue of Barbara Jordan on the campus. So this person came full circle, but this is a person who really stood up. I think her life story is a real example of somebody who stood up for what they think is right. And then this thing of telling the truth, they can take it. The reason I put George Marshall up there, I think you could probably line up 100 Americans and maybe 2 of them would know what Marshall contributed to the 20th century in this country. But in World War I, which we just celebrated the 100th anniversary of. In 1917, when Marshall went to Europe, he was the chief of operations for one of the 22 divisions that were in Europe, and General Pershing was the overall commander in Europe. And one day Pershing went to Marshall's unit, and he was observing some maneuvers, and the maneuvers did not go well. And Pershing, you don't get a nickname like Blackjack because you're warm and fuzzy. So Pershing lined up the divisional staff, including Marshall's boss, the commanding general, General Siebert, and proceeded to chew him out about how bad these maneuvers had gone. As Pershing turned to leave and go to his staff car, Marshall, a colonel, grabbed his arm and said, "General, you need to listen to what the facts really are here." And he proceeded to tick off a list of about 10 things that Pershing's staff had fouled up, which really contributed to things going badly. And Pershing stared at Marshall and said, "Well, that's fine, Colonel. We all have our own problems." And he got in his car and drove off. And everybody said, "Well, George, it's nice knowing you, but obviously your career is over now and you'll be heading back to the States." And exactly the opposite happened. Within 6 months, Pershing had Marshall on his staff because he said, "I finally told somebody who'll tell me the truth about what's going on around here." And I think the last dimension of this integrity issue is, are you really proud of yourself? At the end of the day, you got to look in the mirror in the morning. And are you really proud of what you're doing? It's all about character. If you go to the next slide, we just celebrated another July 4th. And you think about the 50-odd men who were in Philadelphia in 1776 in late June and early July, sweltering heat. I don't think most people realize that exactly in that first week of July, while they were signing the Declaration of Independence, there were thousands of British troops landing in New York Harbor on dozens of English warships. Now you can imagine, if you've ever seen one large ship under sail, you can imagine what about 4 dozen look like coming into New York Harbor with over 10,000 British troops. And their job is to march to Philadelphia and hang every one of these guys as traitors to the crown. And you think about the character it took for those guys to stand up for what they thought was right. So this integrity issue is so foundational to your effectiveness, not only as a business person or anything you're going to do in life. So it's just incredibly important. And as I said, every effective person I've seen has that integrity really embedded in them. So let's go to the next slide. This curiosity issue is incredibly important. It goes to competence. If you don't have intellectual curiosity, for whatever field you choose, you're not going to be very good at it. And ideas drive organizations and progress. And the reason I put Marie Curie up there, another interesting juxtaposition of Curie and Bill Marriott. Curie was the first woman in Europe to be awarded a PhD in the physical sciences. And she goes on to win not one, but 2 Nobel Prizes, one in physics, one in chemistry. Incredible accomplishments. And there was an interesting quote about her from Einstein, who said, of all celebrated beings, Marie Curie is the one least corrupted by fame. She couldn't care less about the fame. It was all about the ideas and all about progress and being a world-class learner. And I really think what I've seen is world-class leaders are world-class learners. They tend to listen more than they tend to talk. And you've got to create this safe environment for debate. I think one of the things I've noticed in the job I'm in is it's very easy to get told what you want to be told. And it's incredibly important to create an environment where you really encourage active debate. And this thought of a desk is a dangerous place from which to watch the world. I put Bill Marriott up there because Bill Marriott, coming back from a Mormon mission kind of at the turn of the 20th century, was walking around Washington, D.C. on a hot summer day, and he noticed that all these people are lining up to buy, root beer and ice cream from these vendors. And he said, there's got to be a way for me to make that on a bigger scale. So he bought the A&W franchise, the root beer franchise around Washington and Baltimore, and he built that into the Marriott Corporation. But one of the things Marriott was always known for is he wasn't in his office very much. He was always wandering around his hotels, talking to people, trying to get ideas on how to make it better. And you really got to have that commitment, particularly as a senior leader, to have an external focus and to keep generating this sense of curiosity about your craft, because it truly is ideas that drive organizations. So let's go to the next slide. This sense of optimism, leading from optimism, this thought that pessimism doesn't engage anyone. And it's not optimism in this Pollyannish sense of, let's all hold hands and sing Kumbaya and everything's going to be fine. I mean, in my 8 years here at Clorox, we've gone through 3 major disruptions. One was obviously the worst recession in our lifetime, about 5-6 years ago. The second one in 2011 was when Carl Icahn came into our stock, and that was a lovely 7 months dealing with him. And then we've had some real issues in Venezuela and Argentina the last year with price controls on our products and double-digit, in fact, triple-digit inflation, and trying to work through these issues in developing markets. But it's not optimism rooted in, we're going to make it all go away. It's optimism rooted in a fundamental belief that you're going to win over time. You'll figure it out. You'll get the team together and you'll figure it out. I put Colin Powell up there because when Powell was chairman of the Joint Chiefs, one of his favorite sayings was optimism is a force multiplier. And no one wants to surround themselves with negative energy. I mean, you've all probably been around people with that kind of attitude, and it just really turns people down, turns the energy in an organization down. That optimism creates such positive energy throughout an organization, and things are going to go bad occasionally, and you've got to have that positive energy in an organization. And optimism obviously creates possibilities, and optimists are more problem solvers. The reason I put Margaret Thatcher there, when Thatcher was Prime Minister of the UK, the first woman to be Prime Minister, the UK and the European economy in the late 70s, early 80s was in the doldrums. And it was Thatcher who really drove the privatization of industry, whether it was British Airways or other industries, to try and to get some energy and problem solvers into those businesses. But she really started to unlock the economy by privatization, which really swept across Europe. So this sense of optimism, and I'm sure most of you have, is critical. And I'm sure a number of you have read Good to Great, the old classic. But there's an interesting chapter in Good to Great, an interesting section, where Collins interviewed Admiral Stockdale, who was awarded the Medal of Honor in Vietnam. He was a prisoner of war for about 6 years. And Collins asked Stockdale who survived that experience. And Collins thought Stockdale would say the optimists. And Stockdale said, "Oh, no, they died." And he said, I don't get that. And he goes, well, let me explain it to you. The optimists who were overly optimistic would say, it's December, we're going to get out of here by Easter, and Easter would come and go, and they wouldn't get out. And then we'll get out by the 4th of July, and that would come and go, we wouldn't get out. He said the guys who survived were the guys who were realists, but they had this underlying prevailing faith that they would win in the end, but they would confront the reality they were in and deal with it. So that's what I mean by this optimism. You got to confront the facts, confront the reality you're in, deal with it, but you've got this underlying prevailing faith, we're going to win this thing. And that's what really energizes organizations. So let's go on to the next slide. Compassion, not something you hear very much about in a business context, but I think it's the glue that holds a lot of organizations together. And I tried to make this point when I was doing this New York Times interview, that if you want to engage the best and the brightest, you better ensure that they think you care more about them than you care about yourself, and that what you're really interested in is helping them grow and being successful, and then everybody gets successful. I put Martin Luther King and Cesar Chavez there because these two men had no power, none. They had tremendous authority, moral authority, but they had no power. They weren't presidents, they weren't CEOs, heads of state, but they had tremendous moral authority. And the selflessness that they exhibited magnified their authority. When people think that you care more about them and care more about the team, it magnifies your authority. And when you think about the spirit of the law is as important as the letter of the law, and I think both of them exhibited that. And I think my own experiences as I've gone up in organizations, whether it was at Coca-Cola or Clorox, I've always had this belief that we all know life's not very fair. But when you get into a situation where you do have some power, you try to make it as fair as possible. You try to make policy that ensures that everyone gets a fair shot. And that's why I've been so focused on, when Professor Murphy talked about the educational foundation we set up, it was because how do you make this thing more fair for people? And my wife and I think one of the keys is education. And then the fact is, tough love is required too in this thing. There are difficult decisions that have to be made, and sometimes that's not a lot of fun. But at the end of the day, it's compassion for the whole, not just a certain part of the whole. So incredibly important. Let's go to the last trait, humility. And again, I put Charles de Gaulle up here. It wouldn't exactly be an exemplar of humility, but let me explain it and why I put him up there. And then you can see the picture of myself and my wife with Nelson Mandela, and I'll explain that in a minute. But this issue of humility is about approachability and accessibility and using authority, not power. One of the things that's interesting to me, what I've learned as I've gone up organizations, is the more power you're given, and the less you use it, the more authority you're given by people. And I don't know if that sounds counterintuitive to you, but everybody, if you're a 4-star general in the military, you don't have to tell people you're a 4-star general. They can see it on your collar, and people know what position you are in an organization. You don't need to remind them of that. And it's this difference between compelling people to do things using power versus persuading people to do things because it's the right thing to do. And then you're given much more authority to get things done. And being approachable, you learn what's really going on. If you conduct yourself with a sense of humility, that none of us have all the right answers. And what's really important is not who's right. What's really important is what's right. And I think that's one of the lessons of humility. And it's not that, you don't have an ego. Everybody's got an ego that's successful. Something drives you. You wouldn't be at Notre Dame if you weren't successful. But there's a difference between having an ego and having a sense of humility of you know what, I'm not that good. Everybody's got some limitations, and that's that quote that's attributed to de Gaulle many times. There was that none of us are indispensable, and the cemeteries of the world are full of indispensable men. The story goes that when de Gaulle was forming his government after World War II, he was approached by a number of the ministers in his cabinet as he was forming his government, and they were talking about one individual that they said, we really need to get into this cabinet, and basically were implying to de Gaulle that he was indispensable. And of course, de Gaulle thought he was the only one that was indispensable to France. And de Gaulle's comment was, yeah, right, the cemeteries of the world are full of indispensable men. So no one's indispensable, but we've all seen the opposite side too, where one individual's had an incredible impact on an organization. So it's always this balance. And I think respect for the individual is the cornerstone of humility. The reason I put the picture of Mandela there, I had the opportunity when I was running the Southern Africa business for Coca-Cola. So as Professor Murphy said, I had the bottom 10 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And I was based in Johannesburg. And this was from 1998 to 2000. So I was there during the last year and a half of Mandela's presidency. And Coca-Cola was responsible for about 2% of the GDP of South Africa. It was a major economic engine because of all the informal markets that people would set up. Anybody could buy a case of Coke and set up a stand on a corner and sell Coca-Cola. You could find it anywhere and everywhere in Africa. And so we had a fairly close relationship with President Mandela as a company. In fact, when Mandela was released from prison in 1990, the first person he asked to see, first business person he asked to see, was Carl Ware, the senior African American at Coca-Cola, who was my boss. They had a fairly tight relationship. So anyway, as President Mandela was retiring in 1999, my task was to say goodbye to him on behalf of the Coca-Cola system in South Africa. So we were thinking about what do you give President Mandela as a going away gift? And my communications director was Zulu. And I was talking to him before I had this meeting with President Mandela, and he said, I said to him, well, maybe I should get him some really good African art. And he said, right, Don, Nelson Mandela doesn't need any more African art. Why don't you give him your Marine Corps officer's sword? And I said, I'm not going to give President Mandela my officer's sword, but it just so happened that I had two of them. And just to give you a little background, the Marine Corps officer's sword, and I think there are a few Marines in the audience, former Marines in the audience, that sword's been passed down for over 200 years. It was awarded to a Lieutenant O'Bannon off the coast of Libya in 1803 by the Shah, the Sultan of Tripoli, for running the Barbary pirates off the coast of Libya. And that sword obviously stands for duty and honor, and it has African roots. And I thought it was a great gift for President Mandela, so I gave him my second sword. And the reason he's laughing in that picture is because at the time, Gaddafi was still in charge in Libya. And I said, now you can tell your friend Colonel Gaddafi that you have a U.S. Marine sword, and somehow that he thought that was incredibly funny, that he could tell Gaddafi he had a Marine sword. So Mandela, respect was the cornerstone of everything he did. So we have this meeting, my wife and I meet with President Mandela in his living room. And we're going into his dining room to have breakfast, and there's a young photographer taking our picture, took that picture. And as we're going in, and President Mandela said, let's go eat. And so we started to walk in, and the photographer was hanging back. And President Mandela stopped and turned and looked at this young guy and said, well, have you eaten? And he said, no, sir, I haven't eaten. And he said, well, then come, join us, sit. And that was the way Mandela was. It didn't matter who you were, he treated people like that. It was an incredible thing to see. And what you saw was what you got with him. So it was an incredible lesson to me about that basic respect for people and how that engages people. So let's go to the next slide. So when you think about this rallying people to this better future, I mean, the better future is the head side of this, the vision. What's this vision you create? What's this vision for this better future? Rallying people is the heart side. It's those values and those traits that really enable you to rally people. It's an emotional thing. And real leaders, you take the people and the assets that have been entrusted to you, because it is a trust, and you make them more productive and more valuable. And if you truly embrace those traits, and I've seen it now across a number of companies and of course the military, you can really inspire people and make a difference. Let's go to the next one. So when I think about trying to translate that at Clorox, when you think about traditional companies on the left side of that screen, it's pretty much the normal hierarchy going up to senior leadership. And what we've tried to do here is flip it on its head and say, look, the senior leadership in this company works for everybody else. One of the first plant visits I did in one of our manufacturing facilities when I first got here, I walked into the plant, and on the leadership board, as you walked into the lobby of the plant, it had the plant manager's picture, it had the manufacturing director, and there were about 5 pictures of leadership, and they were all ascending up to my picture, which was at the top of this pile. And I said, that's great. The only thing is you got it reversed. You got it backwards. Put me on the bottom and point the arrows up. We all support the plant manager and the people in the plant. And within a week, all the plants had changed that around. And it sounds like a small thing, but it was symbolic to say, it's got to be that way. And everything communicates. So let's make sure it's communicated the right way. Let's go to the next slide. The reason I put Jackie Robinson in here, this thing of a life is not important except in the impact it has on other lives. That is the only thing that's on Jackie Robinson's tombstone. I mean, here was a man who, I think most of you know, broke the color barrier in baseball in 1947. I think what most people don't know is that Jackie Robinson was one of the first African-American U.S. Army officers during World War II. And in 1945, years before Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to go to the back of the bus in Alabama, Jackie Robinson was court-martialed at Fort Hood, Texas, for refusing to go to the back of a bus because he was told to sit in the back so a white officer could sit in the front. He was court-martialed for that. He was acquitted at court-martial, so he wasn't convicted. But this was a guy who was a civil rights pioneer long before it became fashionable to be a civil rights pioneer. And then 2 years later, he breaks the color barrier and puts up with incredible insult for at least a year and a half in the major leagues, and dies at the age of 53, probably from the stress of all of that. But that's the one thing. There's nothing on his tombstone about his baseball career or his Army career. It's just that thought. And I think it's probably one of the most important thoughts, that as we all look at our own career, are you truly having an impact on other people's lives or not? Because that's what it's all about at the end of the day. So with that, why don't we just open it up to questions?
Here, Pat, I'll hand you the microphone so you can toss it around.
Well, let's start by giving Don a round of applause. I thought it was an excellent presentation. And I think he'll be with us momentarily here. So you need to talk into the microphone so he can hear you. So who's going to be first?
Can you hear me, sir?
I can.
Okay, great. Well, first of all, thank you very much for being with us today. And I really liked your thought and your anecdote about the way that you reverse the order at the plants. But I'm wondering if you have any other insights or any other advice about the way to make that attitude more practical and more effective in people's lives rather than sort of a platitude. Because I can definitely see that even though it's a very nice gesture, I'm just curious if you have any insights about how to make that attitude more effective rather than something we say to make ourselves feel good.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. For me, it was getting into a series of initiatives, and I would say this: it started with this principle of everything you do communicates. Everything communicates. So I'll give you another example of what I did to try and bring this alive. So when I got here, we were not doing quarterly town hall meetings to talk to the organization about our quarterly results and inform everybody. And there was no celebration of service. And there's a lot of longevity in this company. So one of the things I instituted was I said, every individual in this company and their spouse or significant other, I want to bring to the Bay Area when they hit their 30th, 35th, or 40th anniversary. And frankly, I thought, well, it'll be a neat gesture, and every quarterly town hall meeting will get these folks up on stage. And it was typically 10 to 20 to 30 people. And we were flying people in from around the country and from around the world who had that kind of longevity. And I thought it would show basic respect for their service and the fact that they had built this company, not just a few leaders. So we instituted that. 8 years later, I can tell you that I can't tell you how many times I'm walking through one of our plants, one of our sales offices. I could be in Buenos Aires, I could be in Santiago, Chile, I could be in Sydney, Australia, I could be in the US, and how people talk about that gesture and how it showed respect for people and how it showed that the leadership was more focused on the people than it was on themselves. So it's understanding this principle that everything communicates. So look through that lens and really understand how you communicate basic respect of people and honor what they do. And so it was doing that. It was doing the pictures. I have monthly lunches that anybody who wants to sign up to have lunch with me, I don't care who they are in the organization, can sit down and have lunch and tell me what they want to tell me. And no one else is in the room but me and that small group. So it was just a series of initiatives we put in place to make sure that it was focused on our people, not on the leadership.
Very good. Do you use the terminology servant leadership at all, Don? That's kind of what you're...
Yeah, we do use that. We use this terminology of inverted pyramid. It seems to really resonate with people.
Hi, Don. My name's Pete Lee. Just had a question for you. It's really appropriate right now, probably with the announcement you mentioned was released to the press a few hours ago. But from your position, kind of as the ultimate leader, I guess, of Clorox, how do you know when it's time to move along, step aside, make room for someone else to come in, take that position, and then go ahead and express those thoughts to, your employees and those you work with on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah. Yeah, good question. Pete, aren't you one of the former Marines?
Yes, sir. Friend of Martin and Jimmy.
Yeah, good. Gotcha.
And Matt's sitting next to me. So.
Yeah, good to see you again, Matt.
How you doing?
Pretty good. Yeah, let me tell you how I got to that conclusion. When I got here, I think if you're privileged enough to have one of these leadership jobs like I've had the privilege of having, almost from the day I walked in, I said, I've got to start preparing the next generation to take over at some point, with this thought that no one's indispensable. So about 4 years ago, I started talking to our board about my own plans and saying, I'm 63 years old now, and it's getting to the point where I'm going to want to do some other things. But we started this process 4 years ago, and I had a series of moves with people where I got people into developmental roles, and I got to the point where I saw the leadership profile that I wanted to see, both from the head standpoint, strategic standpoint, and also the heart standpoint, just going through those traits, where I got several individuals who I thought could take this role. And I think you get to the point where you finally say it's time for the other generation to have a chance to have their impact on the organization. So it really was a kind of a checklist, Pete, against the head side. Did I see the strategic thinking ability, those capabilities you need on the strategy side, the head side? And then did they embrace those traits? Could I check it off and look in the mirror and say they really will keep the culture going the way I thought? And then get out of the way and let them go. And so I think a lot of people try to hang on to these kinds of jobs too long. And if you're really purposeful about it, I think you can certainly develop somebody internally to do it. I'm surprised by how many CEOs I've heard recently where, they've been there for a long time and all of a sudden we're going to do an external search because we don't have anybody. And I mean, to me, that's a real shame when you've been in some place for 6, 8, 10 years and you don't have somebody to take your place. That's one of your principal priorities as a leader, to prepare the next generation. So it really is checking off the head side, checking off the heart side, feeling confident they can do it.
Yes, to your point, Don, we had a speaker here probably 6 or 8 years ago from Caterpillar, well-known heavy equipment manufacturer, and their CEO
Right.
said, there's about a dozen people back home who could do my job. And I thought that was a great comment,
Yeah.
that there's plenty of bench strength, shall we say. A couple more
Yeah.
questions, and then we... All right.
Hi, I was just wondering how you translated the leadership you learned in the Marine Corps to the business and corporate world.
I'll tell you a quick story on that, because I think this, and Pete and Matt probably can relate to this especially well, but I think you can all relate to this. The one thing the military taught me was, well, first, it's mission first, but it's all about your people. And I remember, this is interesting. In the Marine Corps, every officer had to be infantry trained, so it didn't matter if you were artillery or a tanker or a pilot. It didn't matter. So I'd been in the Marine Corps 15 months through schools before I actually got to a line unit, and it's and you can't make this stuff up. The very first day I was in a line unit, I was stationed in Hawaii, which was really pretty tough for me, but. And I was flown over to the Big Island from Oahu to join my unit. And I was in artillery, and my unit had been in the field for several weeks training. And I was jeeped out to the firing point where these Marines were at for several days, and they hadn't had any hot food. And so I talked to the battery commander, and I talked to the battery gunnery sergeant, who was the senior enlisted guy in the battery, who's kind of like the enforcer, if you will, for the battery, keeps everybody in line. And as kind of a treat, the commanding officer of the battery had requested hot food be brought out from the base camp because they hadn't had any hot food for several days. So they bring it out, and they're setting up the mess tent, and everybody's starting to line up for this food. And I've been up since 5:30 in the morning. I'm pretty hungry. And I start to try to get near the front of this line. And this battery gunnery sergeant grabs my shoulder and he says, "Lieutenant, in the field, the men always eat first. If there's anything left, you can have some." And I said, "Okay, Gunny, I get it." And I never forgot that. And that's what it is. I think in the military, it's all about your people. And the same thing's been true at Clorox. There are 8,200 people in this company. And it's a team sport. I mean, it isn't about me. It's about everybody rowing in the same direction. And I think that experience in the military beat it into my head that you're only going to be successful if you surround yourself with great people and let them do their job.
Hey, thank you, sir, and thanks for doing this. I was actually wondering if you could just take that one step further. As a veteran myself, a lot of classes that I've taken, I've tried to make sure that I'm taking that one step further and seeing what the civilian equivalent or how we can take lessons from the military and expand them into the civilian world. Could you be more specific about what one can do as a college graduate or as a manager to put people first? I've noticed you alluded to the officers eat last
Right.
idea. Could you be specific, like on a day-to-day basis in the work environment, how you can do that?
Yeah. I'll give you an example of, it goes back to this principle of everything communicating. When I came to the Clorox company, I had 6 direct reports. And the chief marketing officer, the chief customer officer, the head of research and development, and the head of product supply did not report to me, and they were not part of the executive committee of the company. And I said, I don't know how I'm going to get unvarnished feedback from those core functions when they all report into someone else who then reports to me. I need to have them sitting at the table with me. I can't have these filters throughout the company. So I broadened the leadership. I doubled the leadership of the executive committee from 5 or 6 people to 12. And the 5 or 6 people that were on it initially said, "This is not going to work. It's too many people. It's just going to be a food fight at these meetings." And I said, "You know what? If I can't run a meeting with 12 people, then I shouldn't be in this job." And it quickly sent a message through the company that everybody in every function had a seat at the table with the CEO. And everything cascaded off of that. So the word got out. I wanted everybody's point of view. You owe me a point of view how to make this place better. And a lot of initiatives cascaded off that. But so it really starts first with, are you giving everybody access, and does everybody have a seat at the table? And then let's get everybody's viewpoint on the table. And then your ability to align the organization when everybody's represented is much quicker. So in some ways, people thought it would slow things down because we had quote, too many people at the table. It actually sped things up because my ability to get alignment throughout the organization was much quicker by having everybody with a seat at the table. So just think through, as you think about putting people first, the very first thing you got to do is, do you give them a seat at the table or not? And that really started it for me. So there are lots of other things you can do, like we talked about the service awards, etc. But starting by giving everybody a chance to have their point of view represented was incredibly important.
Thanks again for coming. I guess my
Yeah.
question is, in the struggle between sort of short-term profits for a company and putting people first, like employees and consumers, do you think that sort of initiatives you set up, taking employees out to lunch and whatnot, do you think that kind of sets up the best long-term strategy for the company to succeed?
Yeah, it's interesting because I had this question. I remember from one of our investors. Obviously everybody talks about shareholder value and creating shareholder value, and I said, well, frankly, I think our most important constituency is not you. And they looked at me kind of like, what do you mean by that? And I said, well, our most important constituency in this company is our employees. And it's not the consumer, it's not the customer, it's not the shareholder, it's not the supplier. I said, it's our employees. And they go, well, that's a little bass-backwards, isn't it? And I said, well, look, if I don't have the best and the brightest people here, our shareholders are not going to be happy very long. Our consumers are not going to get very happy. Our customers aren't going to be happy. Our suppliers aren't going to be happy at all. And I think when you stand up in front of your organization and you say, you're the most important constituency I have, it's not the consumer, customer, supplier, shareholder, it's you. But you've got to take that responsibility on to make sure that the rest of those constituencies are covered. It's a very powerful thing when you communicate that to your organization, and then you follow through by honoring their service. The other thing we did, for example, is when I got here, about 2,000 people, 25% of the company, were eligible for bonuses every year. Now all 8,200 people, including the people on the manufacturing lines, have access to bonuses. Everybody gets paid if the company does well, not just a few people. So it's actions like that that bring it alive and say, if you really believe I'm the most important constituency, then prove it to me. And so actions like that, of honoring their service, making them eligible for bonuses, sends a very powerful message, and I think brings it alive.
Thank you. That's great. Since many of the students in the room are taking business ethics or come to Notre Dame because of our reputation in ethics, could you share with them maybe some advice on when their ethics are challenged in the future, how, I'm sure you've been through a number of ethical wars, shall we say, and maybe a few parting bits of advice for our students in the room here.
Yeah, I really do think when I put up those 5 traits, I started with integrity. And as you say, people come to Notre Dame because of your reputation for integrity. It's something you just cannot be fickle about, I guess is the best way to say it. I think, as I said, there are 2 dimensions to integrity, the way I define it. It is telling the truth, but it's also doing it in a constructive way, but it's also giving this point of view, standing up for what you think is right. I don't think you can ever waver from that commitment to your own integrity. I think Hemingway had a great saying. He said, everybody had a built-in bullshit detector. And I think when you look in the mirror, whether you're putting your makeup on or you're shaving, if what you're doing is right, and are you proud of yourself or not. And if you can't stay on that threshold, on that standard that you're really proud of yourself, then I would challenge that you're doing the right thing. And I think we're all going to feel a lot better off if there's that unwavering commitment to integrity. It's both those dimensions, telling the truth, but also standing up for what you think is right. You just sleep a hell of a lot better. And I think regardless of the situation you're in, and we, as you said, Professor, we've been through some interesting things here with like Carl Icahn, for example. We've just you never waver from that. And it's amazing how effective you can be when people know that your brand, your personal brand, stands and starts with integrity. It's amazing how quickly you can get things done. When people don't trust each other, nothing happens very quickly. If you look at the dysfunction in Washington, it's because one side doesn't trust the other side. And I think if you have that unwavering commitment that integrity is the foundation of your personal brand, you'd be amazed how effective you can be.
I think that's a great way to end. So thank you so much for your time and fitting us into your schedule.
Thank you.
Hopefully you can get. Hopefully you get back to Northern Indiana some other time and see us in person.
I'd love to do that. And thanks for the time, and thanks for understanding that I had to be here today, but I wish you all the best.
Thank you.
Take care.